She sat there in the luxurious first-class cabin without shouting, without arguing, simply in silence. But that silence was stronger than any accusation. When the head flight attendant stood before her eyes full of prejudice, and when the entire cabin turned away pretending not to see, she only needed a gentle tap on the phone in front of her. A silent signal. An irreversible change. A few hours later, the woman who once thought she had the power to decide who belonged in that space was escorted off the flight by 2 federal agents. No defense, no applause, just a heavy silence, the silence of awareness and change. Do you think a moment of silence can change an entire system? Today's story will show you. You don't need noise to create an impact. If you love stories that touch your heart like this, don't forget to share the video, and subscribe to our channel to explore more emotional journeys with us. Now, let's begin the story of Naomi Carter, the woman who changed an entire flight simply by not leaving her seat. She stepped onto the plane in silence, dressed simply in a dark coat and neatly fitting jeans. She sat down in the first class without drawing any attention. However, a flight attendant noticed her dissatisfied with her appearance and decided to cause trouble. What no one on the flight knew was that this woman held more power than anyone present. With just a brief phone call, everything changed completely. The sound of the airplane engines hummed like a soothing blanket covering the passenger cabin. The first-class section was nearly full with lights reflecting off the sleek white leather seats, while the soft clinking of glasses could be heard from the golden-coated folding tables. The attendants moved gracefully, expertly navigating between rows of seats, handing out hot towels and drinks with faint smiles. Most passengers didn't even bother to look up, accustomed to the luxurious and indifferent service. In the third row by the window, a black woman sat with a straight posture, her expression calm. She wore a perfectly fitting coat over a gray t-shirt paired with dark jeans. A silver card glinted beneath the hem of her coat as she adjusted her seatbelt. Her name was Naomi Carter, but no one bothered to ask. Naomi made no noise, caused no disturbance. She simply sat quietly in her assigned seat, placing her phone on the table, and waited. At that moment, a flight attendant approached. Her heels clicked on the carpet, each step professional. Her uniform was impeccable, and her golden hair was neatly tucked behind her ears. Her name was Lauren Davis. As soon as Lauren's eyes met Naomi's, a brief flicker of tension passed over her face. Lauren stopped right by Naomi's seat and leaned down. I'll say it again. She spoke coldly, but loud enough to attract attention from those around her. This seat isn't for you. Please return to the economy class. Naomi slowly turned her head, her gaze calm. Unflustered, I presented my boarding pass. She replied calmly, "This is my seat." Lauren forced a smile, her eyes cold as ice. "We don't make mistakes with first-class seating. If you don't move, I'll have to call security." Across the aisle, a middle-aged man in a dark blue suit lifted his head from his newspaper, frowning at the scene. His name was Gregory Harris. In the first row, an elegant older woman wearing a pearl necklace and a wide-brimmed hat whispered something to her companion. Her name was Florence Bennett. The atmosphere in the cabin quickly became tense, though everyone tried to remain composed. Naomi remained serene. "You can call whoever you want," she said gently, resting her hand on her thigh. "I'm not going anywhere." Lauren tightened her grip on the back of the seat in front of her, her face hardening. "We have clear regulations. First class is for VIP guests. I am a VIP guest." Naomi replied, her voice not rising at all. Behind Lauren, a young flight attendant stood awkwardly hesitating while holding a passenger list in her hands. Her name was Chloe Turner. Chloe looked from Naomi to Lauren, her eyes anxious, seemingly wanting to speak up, but holding back when Lauren shot her a glare. Lauren stepped forward, leaning on the seat in front of Naomi. "You cooperate, or I'll have you escorted off the plane before we take off." Naomi reclined slightly, her voice as light as a breeze. "If I were you, I'd think twice. It wasn't a threat, it was a fact." Then she picked up her phone, tapped it once and placed it back on the table. She said nothing more. Lauren let out a cold laugh and gestured to Chloe. "Escort her to the back cabin." Chloe hesitated, her hands trembling as she stepped forward. But instead of moving forward, she froze, staring at the passenger list. Lauren gritted her teeth and replied, "I've checked. Her name isn't on the list. This is first class. Either she moves to the economy class or she'll be asked to leave the flight." Gregory, the middle-aged man in the dark blue suit, leaned slightly forward, his voice calm but firm. "Excuse me," he said. "She said she presented her boarding pass. Maybe you should check again to avoid any mistakes." Lauren spun around, her gaze icy. "Sir, I would appreciate it if you didn't interfere," she replied, her tone sharp. Gregory leaned back slightly in his seat, but his eyes never left her. "I just find it strange that there's this much commotion over a seat." Ignoring him, Lauren turned back to face Naomi. Last warning, Naomi didn't blink. "You're not listening," she said softly. "You're just judging." Lauren's face flushed briefly. She was used to having people obey her, especially those she deemed unworthy of sitting here. She pointed toward the back of the plane. "Your seat is back there." Naomi didn't move. She didn't argue, nor did she explain. Her hands remained neatly placed on her thighs, her phone still resting on the folding table, its screen dark. She lifted her head and stared directly at Lauren. "You're wrong." Her voice remained calm. On the other side of the aisle, an elegantly dressed woman known for her gossiping leaned toward her husband. Her name was Madeline Cross. "She's trying to sneak into first class without paying." Madeline whispered, making sure others could hear. Lauren caught the comment, and a smug smile flashed across her face. "Exactly," she said louder, as if trying to rally the entire cabin to her side. "Some people think they don't have to follow the rules." A few passengers exchanged awkward glances. Some lowered their heads while others peered at Naomi. Yet Naomi showed no emotion. Her gaze was gentle but resolute as she repeated, "You're making a mistake." Lauren paid no attention. Chloe, she barked, "Prepare to call security." Chloe, the young flight attendant near the cockpit, paused for a few seconds before quietly stepping forward. Her face had turned pale with worry. She didn't pick up the phone. Instead, she slipped behind the curtain near the cockpit, biting her lip so hard it turned white. Lauren crossed her arms and stood next to Naomi's seat, like a guard protecting a trench. She stood still silent, but her whole body radiated a sense of threat. The cabin fell into silence, but it was no longer the silence of luxury. It was a stifling, heavy silence. Naomi remained seated, her gaze fixed straight ahead, unmoving, patient, as though she had been through such situations many times before. The plane hadn't even begun to taxi, but the tension had already quietly spread. Time dragged on heavily. Each second felt like an hour. Lauren stood in the middle of the aisle, her chin tilted upward, her posture that of someone who believed she had already won. Naomi stayed still, her breathing steady, her eyes never blinking, The phone remained on the table, its screen dark like a silent reminder. Not long after, Chloe returned her footsteps, hesitant, her face ashen. She walked past Lauren without saying a word. When she passed Gregory, he raised an eyebrow in inquiry, but she avoided his gaze. Lauren grabbed Chloe's arm, whispering urgently, "Is security ready?" Chloe hesitated for a moment, then nodded slightly, her lips pressed tight. "Good," Lauren replied, making sure the passengers could hear. "Let's handle this." Naomi crossed her legs slowly, her voice still soft but clear. "Still trying to push forward, even knowing you're wrong." It wasn't a threat, just a fact. Lauren tilted her head, her voice harsh. "The real wrong is someone occupying a seat that doesn't belong to them." Naomi looked up, her gaze locking with Lauren's. "I haven't violated any rules, I'm following them." The words hung in the air, small but as heavy as stone. Lauren blinked, pausing for a moment, but quickly regained her icy composure. On the other side, Madeline peeked out again, muttering, "She's too much trouble. Why doesn't she just change seats?" Her husband, Leonard Cross, nodded silently, not daring to add anything. Naomi didn't look back. "I'm not moving because I don't need to." She responded, her voice steady. "And no one should be forced to just because of someone else's prejudice." Lauren narrowed her eyes, questioning prejudice. "Don't turn this into a race issue." Gregory stood up slowly, each movement controlled, deliberate. "But isn't it already like that?" he said, looking directly at Lauren. "I boarded after her, and no one asked me a word. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath." Even Madeline fell silent. Lauren's voice suddenly became more shrill. "Sir, this doesn't concern you," Gregory replied firmly. "It concerns all of us because we are all witnesses." Lauren spun around, her face turning red. She stepped closer to Naomi. "Either you leave now, or I'll have you removed." Naomi merely lowered her head gently, tapping her phone. A single touch, no words. Then she raised her head, her voice soft yet cold. "You should think carefully before touching me." Lauren didn't respond. She took half a step back instinctively. No one whispered any more. The first-class cabin was left in heavy silence, as if everyone were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. All eyes in the cabin were fixed on the front. The atmosphere had shifted once again. The balance of power began to tilt in another direction, and for the first time, Lauren felt it clearly. She tried to maintain her cold exterior, but a flicker of anxiety crept beneath her skin. Lauren straightened up, glancing around, hoping for some support from the passengers. But instead of agreement, she only met cold, judgmental stares. The looks that were once vague now became clearer than ever. No one looked at Naomi with suspicion. She didn't need to say anything more. It was her silence that spoke louder than any words Lauren had ever uttered. Naomi's phone remained still on the table, but to Lauren it was like an invisible, ticking time bomb. In her mind, questions repeated. Who did she call? What's coming next? Over by the galley. Chloe gripped the passenger list tightly, her fingers turning white. She glanced back and forth between Naomi and Lauren, her eyes darting nervously. Lauren took a deep breath, trying to regain control. "This is your last chance," she said, her voice now shaking slightly. "If you don't leave the seat voluntarily, I'll have you escorted off before we take off." Naomi remained as composed as ever. "Do whatever you think is necessary," she replied, her tone still calm as it had been from the beginning. "But remember, this decision is yours." Unable to hold back any longer, Lauren spun around and marched swiftly toward the front of the plane. nearly bumping into Chloe, who was standing awkwardly. "Where's the pilot?" Lauren snapped. "He's still in the cockpit." Chloe answered quietly, avoiding Lauren's gaze. "Then tell him," Lauren hissed. "This passenger is disobeying orders. She needs to be removed from the flight." Chloe stood frozen, her face torn between fear and conscience. "Go on," Lauren shouted louder. Reluctantly, Chloe squeezed through the curtain, her hands trembling. Meanwhile, Naomi remained seated, her gaze gently sweeping across the cabin. Gregory gave her a subtle nod, filled with respect. A few other passengers began to realize that the situation wasn't as simple as they initially thought. Even Madeline, the gossiping woman, now looked uneasy instead of smug. Just a few minutes later, the cockpit door swung open. A tall man with graying hair and a stern face stepped out. He was Captain Morgan Ellis. He scanned the cabin with a hint of surprise in his eyes. He approached Lauren, lowering his voice. "What's going on?" Lauren immediately spoke up, sounding rushed. "This woman has taken someone else's seat. She refuses to leave. She doesn't belong in first class." Captain Ellis's eyes shifted to Naomi, who remained composed, facing him with a direct gaze. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said politely. "Could I see your boarding pass?" Naomi nodded. She slowly reached into her coat pocket, took out the ticket, and handed it to him. Captain Ellis glanced at it quickly, then looked again, frowning deeply. He exhaled sharply, then turned to Lauren, speaking in a low voice. "I need to speak with you privately." Now, Lauren forced a laugh. "What's the issue?" Without answering, Captain Ellis turned, taking the boarding pass with him, and headed back toward the cockpit. Lauren followed her steps heavy. No one in the cabin spoke. Everyone could feel it. Something big was about to happen. Naomi leaned back in her seat, her expression still calm, as if she had already anticipated everything that was unfolding. Her phone remained on the table, still and silent, but it held a quiet expectancy, as if everything was just a matter of time. Inside the cockpit, Captain Ellis stood before Lauren, the door now closed behind them. He studied the ticket intently. Lauren crossed her arms tightly, her face tense. "What's going on?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Captain Ellis looked up, his gaze cold as steel. "Do you know who she is?" Lauren furrowed her brows. "She's just a passenger. That seat isn't hers." Captain Ellis raised the boarding pass high. "Not just a passenger, she's on a special list, VIP, a law enforcement officer." Lauren blinked rapidly. "Law enforcement officer, internal affairs." "Internal affairs." He emphasized airline security oversight. Lauren's stomach twisted. She could barely stand. "That's impossible," she whispered. Captain Ellis's voice became even lower. "I just received a direct message from the airline security office. A call was made." From a very high level, Lauren tried to mask her panic with a forced smile. "Maybe she's an imposter." Captain Ellis didn't bother replying. He handed her back the boarding pass, slow but firm. "Go apologize now, and if you're wise, keep it brief." He didn't need to say more. Lauren knew it was beyond her control now. In the cabin, the atmosphere was thick, almost palpable. Naomi sat still, her eyes fixed on the curtain. Gregory, Madeline, and most of the passengers were on edge waiting. Chloe quietly stood near the aisle, biting her lip until it bled. Finally, the curtain stirred. Lauren stepped out. Her face was visibly pale, each step heavy. She no longer carried the arrogance or confidence she had before. She avoided Naomi's gaze as she moved toward the seats. her steps slow and labored as if every step was a verdict. As Lauren approached Naomi's seat, she paused. She stood still, not immediately speaking. Naomi turned her head to look at her, her brows slightly raised calmly, waiting. Lauren parted her lips as if to say something, but then closed them again. After a few seconds of hesitation, she finally forced out a few words I may have misunderstood. The words came out weak, reluctant, so much so that it was hard to consider them a real apology. Naomi didn't smile, nor did she appear triumphant. She simply replied, "You didn't misunderstand. You made the wrong judgment." Lauren's face immediately turned pale. The silence that followed was worse than any argument. It was like an invisible sentence binding her tightly, right there in the cabin. Without saying another word, Lauren turned, walking quickly toward the back of the plane. Across the aisle, Madeline leaned toward her husband, whispering, "She's lost." Gregory, still watching the unfolding events, nodded slightly. That's what happens when the truth confronts false power. Naomi leaned back in her seat, her eyes directed toward the window. But the atmosphere in the cabin didn't lighten. On the contrary, it became thicker, heavier. Everyone could feel that this wasn't over yet. Lauren disappeared toward the rear of the cabin, her back stiff as though she was trying to hold on to the last bit of dignity she had left. But her facered and tense told it all. She had lost control, and she knew it. No passenger looked at her as she passed by. Near the front of the cabin, Chloe still stood there, her gaze never leaving Naomi. When their eyes met for a brief moment, Chloe nodded slightly as if given a silent acknowledgement. "I see you." Naomi responded with a small nod, brief but profound. Captain Ellis was still standing near the cockpit, briefly exchanging words with the co-pilot. Then, walking into the cabin, he cleared his throat, his steady voice filling the air. "Ladies and gentlemen, our flight will be temporarily delayed for some additional checks. We ask for your patience." No one responded. Most passengers didn't even seem to care about the delay anymore. All eyes were still fixed on Naomi. Madeline sat rigidly in her seat, her manicured fingers tapping lightly on the edge of her champagne glass. Beside her, Leonard had put his phone down his face, clearly anxious, glancing frequently toward the cockpit. Gregory remained seated calm, but now he looked more like a judge awaiting a verdict than a businessman on a trip. As for Naomi, she sat straight, her hands clasped on her lap. She didn't touch her phone, nor did she strike up a conversation with anyone. Yet it was her silence that filled the entire cabin, heavier than any interrogation. 10 minutes passed. The air was thick, tense, like a dense fog. And then the sound rang out, the sound that made everyone hold their breath. The sharp click of leather shoes on the aisle, followed by the quick knock on the cabin door. The entire cabin turned their heads in unison. Captain Ellis quickly walked up and opened the door. The door swung open, and 2 men in black suits stepped inside. They were not regular airport security. They were federal agents, their serious faces framed by headsets. They quickly passed through the cabin, their sharp eyes scanning the room, then nodded to the captain. At that moment, Lauren came out from the galley just in time to witness the scene. Her face immediately turned ashen. One of the agents walked up, exchanged brief words with Captain Ellis. The other turned toward the cabin, his gaze locking directly on Lauren Ms. Davis. He called Lauren, didn't answer immediately. She glanced at Naomi, then at Chloe, and finally back at the agent. The man took a step forward, his voice low but firm. "We need to speak with you right now." The cabin froze. Passengers looked at each other, confused and shocked. Naomi remained still. Lauren glanced around one more time, searching for an ally, an excuse. Someone would say, "She didn't mean it. It's just a misunderstanding." But no one spoke. That silence was heavier than any accusation. Finally, Lauren swallowed hard and took a small step back. Her hands clenched together, trembling slightly by her sides. The agent didn't relent, his eyes emotionless, but his tone unarguable. "We can do this here or in a private room. Your choice." Lauren glanced toward the galley, then to the cockpit as if hoping to find an escape, but there was no way out. Finally, she nodded stiffly and silently followed the two agents toward the front of the plane. The entire cabin was silent, with all eyes watching her leave. Her footsteps were no longer swift, confident as before. They were heavy, lost, as if each step was slowly distancing her from the power she had once held. Nearby, Chloe stepped aside to make room, still gripping the passenger list tightly, as if clinging to the only thing left to keep herself grounded. Naomi remained seated. But for the first time since the flight began, she looked around the cabin. Her gaze met Gregory's. He gave her a small nod, a small but meaningful nod. Farther away, Madeline pretended to look at her phone, her hand trembling. No one spoke. But in that silence, the entire cabin seemed to breathe in unison. They all understood that what had just happened went far beyond a seat. Inside the cockpit, the conversation between Lauren and the two agents continued. No need to hear the words clearly. Just watching Lauren constantly signaling, seeing her face turn pale, her shoulders slump with each response. Everyone could tell this was no longer a normal conversation. This was a sentence. After a few minutes of tension, Captain Ellis stepped out of the cockpit, his face calm but serious. He stood in the middle of the cabin and spoke in a steady voice. "Thank you for your patience, ladies and gentlemen. We will be making a brief landing to handle a personnel issue before continuing our journey. Please remain seated until further notice." A light wave of murmurs rippled through the cabin. Not panic, but astonishment. Gregory whistled softly between his teeth. Madeline leaned toward Leonard and whispered, "Do they really have to land just because of this?" Leonard slowly shook his head. "This isn't a small matter. She's an important person." Madeline furrowed her brow but said nothing more. No need. Leonard had already answered for her. Just a moment later, Lauren appeared again, sandwiched between two agents. Her eyes were red, her hands clenched tightly at her sides, each step heavy as if each one was pulling her deeper into shame. No one clapped, no one cheered, but the silence, thick and heavy, was sharper than any accusation. Lauren didn't dare look at anyone. Not at Chloe, not at any of the passengers, and especially not at Naomi. Naomi remained still. Her gaze silently followed Lauren, her face expressionless. She didn't smile, she didn't nod, she simply existed. When Lauren and the two agents disappeared through the plane's exit, the silence lingered like a dark shadow in the cabin. All that could be heard was the hum of the engines and a few static noises from the announcement system, like the background music to that heavy moment. Chloe finally exhaled, her shoulders relaxing a bit. She slowly walked up to Naomi's row, stopped, bowed her head, and whispered, her voice choked, "Thank you for staying calm." Naomi looked up, her eyes gentle. It's not the first time she replied in a warm tone, but maybe it'll be the last time for her. Chloe bit her lip, not answering immediately. Then she nodded, her eyes filled with tears. She made it personal. "You didn't." Naomi tilted her head slightly because I know she said softly, "It was never about the personal. It's about what people think I represent." Chloe lowered her gaze. "I should have spoken up sooner," she said softly. Naomi remained calm. "You still can." The plane began to slowly taxi away from the gate, preparing for the next takeoff. The passengers sat quietly, but none of them felt the same as before. Something had changed, as if an invisible layer of dust had been wiped away from their perceptions. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself fall into the steady rhythm of her breath. Not to seem strong, but because she truly was at peace. It wasn't pretending. It was a calmness that only comes from having weathered many storms. Down the aisle, Gregory folded his newspaper and placed it under the seat. He sat there, his eyes forward, but his mind drifted to a distant place. He silently bent down to take his laptop from the seat pocket, but then just placed it on his lap without opening it, as if he wasn't ready to return to the familiar world after what he had just witnessed. At the rear of the cabin, Madeline sat motionless, her hands idly playing with her bracelet, her fingers twisting it over and over. She no longer whispered furtively like before. Leonard leaned over and whispered. She never raised her voice. Madeline nodded silently. I expected her to lose control, but she didn't need to. Leonard whispered back. The seatbelt sign lit up, but strangely, no one moved. Everyone was still watching Naomi in silence and respect. No words were needed. Her presence alone spoke volumes. A few minutes later, the aircraft's speaker crackled. Captain Ellis's steady voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to unforeseen circumstances, we will be making a brief stop. The ground team is ready. We will continue our journey once the crew change is completed. Thank you for your understanding." Crew change, just two simple words, but they fell into the cabin like a sweet, sharp knife. No need for detailed announcements. No need for long-winded apologies. Everyone understood Lauren was officially out of the game. Near the galley, Chloe swallowed hard, her hand finally loosening from the passenger list. She walked slowly toward Naomi this time without hesitation. She started, her eyes downcast. I knew something was wrong, but I was scared. Naomi opened her eyes, looking at her directly. Fear makes us hesitate, but integrity makes us act. Chloe nodded faintly, her eyes red as if she had just found herself again. "I didn't act fast enough," Chloe mumbled, her voice tinged with regret. Naomi looked at her with a gentle gaze. "But you acted before it was too late," she replied softly. "That's what matters." Chloe took a deep breath, looking steadier. "They're sending more people from the ground crew. For now, the team is short. One leader I can help, but I've never done it alone." Naomi leaned slightly forward, her voice steady. "You won't be alone." Just a few words, but there was something in her tone that made Chloe stand straighter, her eyes shining with newfound confidence. Behind them, whispers began to stir. This time, not murmurs of judgment, but curiosity, respect, and contemplation. One row back, a young boy leaned toward his mother and asked, "Is she really a cop?" The mother nodded, her eyes never leaving Naomi. "More than that," she answered softly. The plane slowly rolled toward a side gate, far from the main area. Outside the window, a sleek black SUV was already parked next to it. Two men in sharp, simple suits. One was holding a clipboard, the other wearing a headset. When the plane door opened, a rush of cool air flooded in, dispelling the thick atmosphere from earlier. A new staff member stepped into the cabin, confident but not arrogant. He walked straight toward Captain Ellis, exchanged a few brief words, then turned toward Naomi Carter. He asked, his voice full of respect. Naomi slowly stood up. "Yes." He nodded. "We've been informed. You can continue your supervision. Your report has also been forwarded to operations." He paused for a moment, then added, "Thank you for handling things the way you did." Naomi didn't smile. She simply nodded lightly. "I'm not here to punish anyone. I'm here to ensure those who deserve to be held accountable are not allowed to continue hurting others." The staff member subtly stepped aside, making way for her, but instead of leaving, Naomi returned to her seat. She sat down, deliberately, resolutely. "You're not leaving?" Chloe asked softly, a bit surprised. "I'm staying." Naomi replied, "There's still work to be done." Her answer rippled across the cabin like a silent wave. People began to understand. Naomi wasn't here to create a moment. She was here to create change. And now the whole cabin felt that shift. The cabin door closed, the wind's howl through the crack gradually faded, replaced by a new silence. Not silence from fear, not silence from confusion, but silence from respect. The atmosphere inside seemed to have been cleansed. Every sound became softer, every gaze deeper. Naomi sat up straight, her hands resting lightly on the armrests. She didn't need to look around. She knew the room had seen her, understood her, acknowledged her. Not because she asked, but because she didn't need to ask. Chloe, temporarily assuming the role of team leader, moved through the cabin with a more confident stride than before. She no longer hesitated when speaking to passengers, no longer reluctant when taking orders. Her voice was clear, decisive. And this time, no one sneered, no one smirked. Across the aisle, Gregory opened his laptop, typed a few lines, then closed it again. His gaze once more directed at Naomi, given a subtle nod filled with respect. She returned the nod, almost imperceptible. But enough. At the rear of the cabin, Madeline, who had once whispered venomous words, now sat with her knees pulled up, her hands tightly gripping her armrest. Her face no longer held arrogance, only the heavy emotion of shame. Leonard, sitting beside her, glanced at Naomi several times, but said nothing. His silence carried its own weight. In the last row, an elderly woman named Margaret, who hadn't spoken a word throughout the flight, gently opened her handbag, took out a small notebook. She wrote a few lines, tore out the page, and slowly walked over to Naomi. Without saying a word, she gently placed the note on the folding table in front of her, then quietly returned to her seat. Naomi glanced at the note. Just a single line, the handwriting shaky. "You did what I never had the courage to do. Thank you." She folded the paper carefully and placed it in her coat pocket. Then she turned back to look out the window where the endless stretch of runway lights lay beneath the night sky. In her mind, there was now only one deep, unbroken silence. A quiet pause before the next action began. The plane's speakers crackled. Captain Ellis's deep voice echoed, "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We are ready to resume takeoff. Please fasten your seatbelts." The plane began to taxi, and as if in sync with the engines, something else was beginning to stir within the hearts of the passengers. Where there had once been prejudice, now there was reflection. Where there had once been indifference, now there was awareness. As the plane lifted off the ground, Chloe silently passed Naomi's row carrying a bottle of water and a warm smile. "Do you need anything else?" she asked softly. Naomi took the bottle, gently shaking her head. "I'm fine." Chloe smiled genuinely this time and then continued on her way. The plane soared higher, cutting through the dense clouds carrying not just passengers but the quiet lessons just etched into their hearts. Naomi picked up her phone, glanced at the screen, and exhaled slowly. The notification from the airline's regional office had arrived. The matter had officially been escalated to a higher level of investigation. Reports were being collected. Lauren Davis, now not only suspended for this incident, but old complaints against her were also being dug up again. Naomi quietly placed the phone face down on the tray table, then took a sip of water. She wasn't surprised. She had seen it too many times before people like Lauren who didn't just make one mistake, but left a trail of silent wounds wherever they went. But today was different. Today, someone stood up and stopped it. Behind her, a teenage girl whispered to her father. She didn't even need to yell. The father nodded, his eyes still fixed forward. That's why she's strong. Naomi closed her eyes for a brief moment, not because she was tired, but because she was anchoring herself deeper than ever before. The plane was still gliding through the clouds, but she felt as steady as if she were standing on solid ground. She had never raised her voice, never gotten angry, and never needed to justify herself. Respect isn't always loud. Sometimes silence is the thing that breaks the chains of prolonged mistakes. And this flight, this moment, it wouldn't end when the plane landed. It was the beginning of something bigger. After about 35 minutes of flight, the first-class cabin was quieter than usual. No longer were there conversations about contracts or laughter about vacations. No more clinking glasses, only thoughtful silence remained. Everyone seemed forced to ask themselves, how have I seen? How have I reacted to injustice before Naomi remained still? Her gaze fixed through the window. The clouds drifted lazily below the plane's wings, bathed in the golden glow of the afternoon sun. But she didn't pay attention to the scenery. In her mind, the announcement still echoed. Lauren's suspension was official. Not only that 3 old incidents had been brought to light, Naomi didn't feel satisfied, nor did she feel triumphant. Just one simple yet profound emotion: relief. Maybe this time the silence that usually follows injustice wouldn't return. Behind her, Gregory cleared his throat softly, then leaned forward. "If you'll allow me to speak," he began. "I think many people on this flight will go home with a different version of themselves." Naomi turned her head, her gaze meeting his. "That's not a bad thing." Gregory nodded in agreement. "No, it's long overdue." Across the aisle, Madeline peered up from her phone, then silently lowered her head, pretending to focus on the screen. But her face no longer carried the same arrogance. Her posture was no longer confident, but had become more subdued, as if carrying the weight of the realizations she had just made. The sharp, cold glances she had once thrown at Naomi now only held deep regret. Near the galley, Chloe was exchanging words with a substitute flight attendant from the ground crew. Her shoulders were no longer hunched. Her voice was now steady, clear. She no longer needed permission to lead. She had come to understand she didn't need to be allowed to do what was right. Naomi noticed the change in Chloe, but said nothing. She knew sometimes the biggest thing you can do for someone is to let them stand on their own feet. Soon after, Chloe returned with a new towel, her gaze gentle, sincere. "I know," she said softly. "It can't undo what's happened, but I'm sorry for staying silent for so long." Naomi took the towel, her voice calm. "You spoke up. When it truly mattered." Chloe lowered her head, confessing, "I was scared. I was afraid of losing my job." Naomi responded, not a hint of reproach in her voice, "But you still chose to stand up. And that's what really matters." Chloe smiled this time. The smile was genuine, clear. "You remind me of someone," she said softly. "Someone I used to admire." She never needed to raise her voice, but when she spoke, everyone listened. Naomi smiled slightly. She must have been someone worth remembering. "Yes," Chloe replied, her voice choked. "Just like you." The plane's speakers came on, and Captain Ellis announced that the plane had reached cruising altitude and the meal service would begin shortly. But no one paid attention to dinner. What had happened in the air weighed heavier than any tray of food could bring. Near the back of the cabin, Margaret, the elderly woman who had sent the thank-you note earlier, slowly stood up again. This time, she no longer hesitated. She slowly walked up to Naomi's row, gently placing a frail hand on the armrest. She spoke, her voice steady and sure. "You've shown everyone here what real strength is. Not the strength to suppress, but the strength to uphold dignity, even when others try to take it from you." Naomi looked up, her gaze deep. "It's not the first time I've had to do that." Margaret nodded slowly, but perhaps it's the first time many of them didn't turn a blind eye. Behind Naomi, many passengers subtly nodded, almost instinctively. She didn't need a stage. She didn't need titles or speeches. She led through silence, through steadfastness, simply by sitting still, unflinching, never compromising her dignity, just to make others comfortable. The cabin was no longer merely a place for flights. It had become a shared space of memory, a memory that each person here would carry longer than the flights they were on. For the first time in a long while, Naomi felt a sense of hope that this memory would spread further beyond the boundaries of this plane. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane stabilized at cruising altitude. Amber lights along the aisles cast a warm glow on the passengers sitting there, not in the usual comfort, but in a quiet contemplation. No one opened the entertainment screens. No one asked for another blanket or inquired when dinner would be served. Everyone sat in stillness, a strange silence full of reverence carrying an indescribable weight. Naomi glanced at the neatly folded napkin on the tray table, slowly wiped her hands as if to remind herself that she was still here in the real world after all that had transpired. But her mind was elsewhere. She was reviewing every moment, not with regret, but with understanding. She had held back, but not in weakness. She had waited, not out of fear, but to take control of her own self. And in doing so, she had shaken the whole room without ever standing up. The steady hum of the engine served as background music, guiding a scene still hanging in the air charged with emotion. Gregory slowly stood and moved closer to Naomi's seat. He stopped, not imposing, not showing off, simply present. "I work in public policy," he said gently. "Educational reform. I've sat in many rooms where people talk for hours, but no one ever really says anything meaningful." Naomi looked up, her gaze steady. "What you did today," Gregory continued, "didn't need speeches, didn't need attention, but it created a moment more powerful than any law I've ever seen passed." "I didn't come here to create a moment," Naomi replied calmly. "I know." Gregory nodded. "And that's why it has power." He nodded once more and quietly returned to his seat. It wasn't a compliment. It was recognition. At the far end of the cabin, Chloe sat resting on the jump seat. She pulled out her phone, her finger hovering over the screen for a long while. Finally, she opened a draft message to her mother. "You were right. Doing the right thing is scary. But what's worse is staying silent." She hadn't sent it yet, but she had saved it in another row. Madeline sat stiffly, her hands tightly clasped together. The woman who had been the loudest at the beginning of the flight now seemed as if she were seeing herself through a broken mirror. She picked up her phone again, not to scroll through social media, but to delete an old post about deserving one's seat. She didn't know Naomi had seen, but Naomi didn't respond. She didn't need to. A few rows behind a young couple whispered, "She's wearing a badge." "Yeah," the husband replied. "Internal affairs." Hard to imagine, the wife whispered, "What if she hadn't spoken up?" "Exactly, because she hardly said anything." The husband replied, "Is why it's impossible to forget." Up front, the acting team leader Trevor walked over to Chloe. "Are you okay?" he asked. Chloe nodded. "Better now. It's just this flight has been different." Trevor smiled lightly. That's what happens when truth enters the room. Suddenly, the cabin speaker crackled. Captain Ellis's warm voice filled the space. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have reached optimal cruising altitude. We will resume service as usual. I also want to sincerely thank you for your patience and cooperation during today's unexpected personnel adjustments." He paused for a beat. "I'd also like to emphasize the importance of responsibility. Every passenger on this flight deserves respect, regardless of uniform background or title." The announcement ended, but it wasn't just a formality. It carried its own clear message. A silent wave of understanding spread throughout the cabin. Many passengers subtly nodded. Some looked toward Naomi. Others sat quietly absorbing everything that had happened. Naomi glanced at the flight log the ground crew had handed her earlier. Her notes were brief but sharp. Her report would be submitted before landing. She had fulfilled her duty. But more than that, she had upheld her dignity, and in doing so helped restore dignity for those who had been watching. The plane glided gently through the night, but what had happened inside the cabin had weathered a much larger storm, and everyone felt it. Naomi, as always, remained calm, composed. But now she didn't need to give orders, because sometimes true strength doesn't require a uniform. True strength is simply being recognized. And no one on this flight would dare look away. The cabin lights shifted again, preparing for the evening leg of the journey. The window shades were lowered halfway, casting a soft, gentle light onto the rows of seats, creating the illusion of peace. But for most of the passengers on this flight, that peace felt far away. What had happened before didn't disappear. It had rooted itself into each person's memory like a silent weight that couldn't be shaken off. The dinner carts began to slowly roll down the aisles. Chloe Turner, now the temporary leader, moved with a confidence she had never had on any flight before. Her voice had found a steady rhythm, calm, warm, and passengers responded to her with glances, with patience, with something very close to gratitude. She was no longer the little assistant following orders. She was the one who had preserved kindness when things became most difficult. When she reached Naomi Carter's row, Chloe didn't ask the usual questions like beef or chicken. Instead, she paused, her gaze gentle, sincere. "Are you okay?" she asked in a soft, private tone, not professional. Naomi looked up from her meal, her eyes still composed. "I'm fine. Is there anything I can help you with?" Chloe hesitated, then nodded, her throat taut with emotion. "Treat everyone as they deserve even when no one is looking," Naomi replied. Chloe nodded this time more firmly. "I promise." She continued serving the other rows, but that brief exchange left a deep resonance in the air, deeper than any announcement or speech could ever bring. It wasn't just words. It was the silent understanding between two people. One who chose to stand firm. One who chose to speak up. At the rear of the cabin, Gregory Harris finally pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket. He quickly jotted down a few lines, tore the page out, and discreetly passed it to Trevor Benson, the acting team leader. Trevor unfolded the note and read it quickly. 4 simple words. She saved your brand. He looked up, his gaze instinctively landing on Naomi. No more words needed to be said. He understood. Across the aisle, Madeline Cross sat motionless. The meal in front of her was still steaming faintly, but she hadn't touched it. Leonard, her husband, slowly chewed each bite, but his eyes would occasionally glance over at his wife. Finally, Madeline whispered, her voice so low that only he could hear. I thought I understood what respect was. He looked up, pausing his chopsticks in midair. But it turns out I only respected those who were like me, who acted the way I expected. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. That confession had said everything. Up front. Naomi remained calm. She took a small sip of water, occasionally picking at her meal. No smile, no smugness, no response to the stares, the whispers that floated around her. She didn't need to prove anything. She didn't need to explain, because the power of truth is that it exists without asking for permission. After serving the passengers, Chloe quietly returned to the galley where Trevor was reviewing the passenger list on a tablet. You know, she said softly, her eyes fixed on the tablet. She's not just a passenger. Trevor wasn't surprised. I know, he replied, corporate just called back. She didn't just come to observe, she's a senior advisor for the airline's ethics department. She's one of the people who directly drafted the code that Lauren violated. Chloe's eyes widened in disbelief. So she knew everything from the start. Trevor nodded, and she chose to let things play out, to give us a chance to correct our mistakes. Chloe leaned lightly against the cold metal wall, and we failed. Trevor placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. But you did, when it truly mattered. At the front of the cabin, Captain Morgan Ellis appeared again. He moved slowly down the aisle. When he reached Naomi's seat, he stopped. His voice was deep but clear. Ms. Carter. He said, "Thank you for your patience today. I know this shouldn't have happened," he continued, "and I know that an apology cannot undo what has happened, but I still want to say it." Naomi looked up as calm as ever. "You didn't create the problem," she said gently, "but you also didn't turn your back on it." Captain Ellis nodded, his expression respectful. "If there's anything else I can do, make sure this doesn't happen to the next person," Naomi replied succinctly. He nodded again, slowly, then turned and walked away. That brief response, like a quiet lesson, lingered in the cabin. In row 6, a middle-aged mother leaned toward her teenage son. That's real strength. Not needing to yell, not needing to be harsh, just being clear. The boy nodded, his wide eyes as if the world inside him had shifted slightly. And in that moment, as the plane glided gently through the dense clouds, everyone on the flight carried with them a newfound awareness. They had witnessed something greater than a confrontation. They had witnessed a quiet shift, and it couldn't be undone. A change that began with one woman, one seat, and an unwavering resolve not to move. The cabin now settled into darkness, not just because the sunlight had dimmed, but because of the sacred silence that hung in the air after the storm of truth. The seatbelt signs still hadn't lit back up, but almost no one moved. The passengers sat still, immersed in thought, as if afraid that even a slight movement would erase the lesson that had just been imparted. Naomi sat upright, not from fatigue or formality, but because she had chosen to. She was no stranger to having to sit still in moments when the world expected her to remain silent. But this time, the world couldn't ignore her. She closed her eyes, breathing slowly. Outside, the sky darkened, but inside her, and in the hearts of those who had witnessed a flame had been lit, smoldering but unextinguishable. Naomi Carter did not simply sit in a seat. Others believed she didn't deserve. She held her ground in a world that constantly expected her to shrink. The difference today was for the first time she had truly been seen. The silence in the cabin now was not denial. It was awareness. Naomi turned her gaze to the window below. The world spread out hazy in patches of yellow clouds and the fading glimmers of the setting sun. But up here, everything seemed clearer than ever. From behind, Chloe Turner walked up, carrying nothing. No service tray, no passenger list, just a breath filled with tension. "There's something I need to tell you," she said softly. Naomi turned her gaze steady. Chloe hesitated. "This isn't the first time Lauren Davis has done things like this," she confessed. "She's mistreated others, sometimes quietly, sometimes openly, but no one has ever spoken up." Naomi tilted her head, listening intently. "But now it's different," Chloe whispered. "They're starting to speak up in the internal chat group. Some people have shared that they flew with her years ago and are still haunted by it. Some even quit because they couldn't take it." Naomi nodded slightly. "People usually don't dare to speak up," she said, "until someone breaks the wall of silence first." Chloe let out a deep, heavy breath, as if finally releasing a burden from her chest. "You didn't just stop her," Chloe said, her voice trembling. "You gave everyone the courage not to stay silent anymore." Naomi's gaze didn't waver. "That's what transparency really brings," she responded. "It gives people a place to stand up with courage." At that moment, the cabin speakers emitted a small beep, but this time it wasn't Captain Ellis's voice. A female voice rang out, formal yet familiar. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am Samantha Pierce, Vice President of Communications for the company. We sincerely thank you for your patience and understanding today." She paused for a beat, her tone becoming more solemn. "A comprehensive review is underway regarding the recent incident, and the management team has initiated a new staff oversight procedure that will be implemented immediately. We regret what happened, but we are grateful that it has been brought to light in the proper way. We are committed to addressing this internally and, more importantly, transparently." Click. The speaker fell silent. The space settled into quiet again. A few passengers looked up at Naomi. She didn't react, no waves, no smiles. She simply sat there, but her presence was stronger than any title or position. She had become the story without ever seeking attention. Across the aisle, Madeline Cross could no longer pretend. For the entire hour, she had tried to avoid Naomi's gaze, pretending to be busy with her phone, but the guilt had accumulated too much. Slowly, she stood up, her heels clicking softly on the floor. Drawing a quiet look from many others, Madeline walked over to Naomi's row, her heart pounding in her chest. She stopped, took a deep breath. "I talked about you." She began, her voice so soft it was almost inaudible. "Before I knew who you were, before I truly saw you." Naomi didn't look up. She let the silence speak for her. "I judged you." Madeline continued, her voice faltering. "I thought you didn't belong here. I assumed, because I was always allowed to assume." Now Naomi looked up. Her eyes met. Madeline's, not coldly, not angrily, just simply, honestly. And now she asked, "What do you see?" Madeline's voice caught in her throat. "Someone I perhaps couldn't do what you've done. even for 5 minutes. Naomi didn't smile. No comforting words. She simply nodded. Then she said, "Learn from it." Madeline swallowed, nodding, as if committing to something. She returned to her seat this time with her head bowed low, not out of shame, but because she was reflecting. Across the aisle, a boy of about 12 leaned toward his father. Why did everyone stay silent when she was yelled at? The father paused for a moment, then responded softly. Because sometimes people are confused, not sure if they should care. The boy furrowed his brow. But shouldn't we always care? The father nodded gently. Yes, always. That was the lesson Naomi Carter had engraved into every inch of the cabin. No need to shout, no need to move, no need to point fingers. She didn't demand change. She simply made it clear why it was necessary. Outside, the sky had darkened to a deep blue. The last light of the day was now just faint streaks along the horizon. The plane glided smoothly above as if cradling the sacred stillness within, and in each person's heart, the baggage they carried now weighed heavier than any suitcase. It was the memory of a woman who had forced them to rethink, who deserves to be seen, who deserves to belong, who has the strength to sit still when the world wants them to disappear. Now the hours passed like slow waves, no urgency, no triviality, just drifting like the silent thoughts swirling deep inside each passenger. The plane continued to soar through the night sky, but the story from hours ago felt as if it had just unfolded. It hadn't faded, it had only sunk deeper. No more cheerful talks about vacations or business projects, no more joyful laughter or clinking glasses. Even the clink of silverware became tentative, as if afraid to break something sacred that had just been born. Naomi remained there, not sleeping, not needing rest. She only needed to be present, and she did that firmly. Not shrinking, not stiff, just existing with a quiet strength that could not be shaken. From a distance, Chloe Turner sat huddled in the jump seat near the galley. Her gaze still silently followed Naomi, not out of curiosity, but out of respect, real respect. At this moment, Naomi Carter was no longer looked at with curious eyes. Those eyes had transformed into respect, genuine respect that made people want to live better, act more rightfully even when no one asked them to. Near the galley, Trevor Collins was quietly speaking with a ground crew flight attendant. His voice was deep and serious. The executive board has scheduled an emergency meeting for all regional staff. Trevor said, "It's not just Lauren Davis who's been suspended. They're also reviewing the person who hired her." The attendant's eyes widened in astonishment. "All because of this flight?" Trevor shook his head, his gaze profound. "It's not because of what happened. It's because of how it was handled." Naomi didn't hear it, but she could feel it. In the row behind her, Charles Mercer was typing quickly on his laptop. Not for work. This time it was a personal article to be sent to a major newspaper. The headline, "The Woman Who Redefined Power at 35,000 Feet." He paused, thinking for a long time before typing the first sentence. He didn't want to exaggerate, nor did he want to over-explain. Naomi never needed to do that. A few rows back, Madeline Cross still sat with her head bowed, fingers tightly interlaced, her gaze fixed downward, unfocused. For over an hour she had repeated in her mind the words she should have said, the words she should have said long ago, but the shame still gripped her throat. Edward, her husband, gently placed his hand on hers. "Say it," he whispered. "You've been silent long enough." Madeline nodded slowly, but her legs felt frozen. A small chime rang from the speaker system. Captain Ellis announced the plane was preparing to land. "We will be landing in approximately 35 minutes. The local time is 7:42 p.m., and the weather is clear." The atmosphere in the cabin shifted. Everyone understood this flight. This moment was no longer just a regular journey. Naomi reached into the seat pocket in front of her and pulled out a dark blue leather notebook, inside which was a sheet of paper with the words printed, "Aviation Compliance and Ethics Review Board." She opened a new page and began writing, not quickly, not hurriedly. Each line came down on the page like steady, sure strokes. It wasn't just about Lauren Davis. It was about the silence of the passengers at first, about the people who had stood up at the last minute, about how respect needed to be redefined and it couldn't just be assumed. Because real change, she knew, doesn't come from empty speeches. It comes from the moment an ordinary person decides, "I won't back down." When finished, she closed the notebook and gently placed it on the tray table. Chloe Turner approached, this time without hesitation. She lowered her voice, as if afraid to disturb the sacred silence in the cabin. "They'll ask about you," Chloe said. "The reporters, the company, even the passengers." Naomi looked up, her gaze bright but calm. "Let them ask." "So how should we answer?" Chloe asked, truly sincere. Naomi thought for a moment, then replied softly, "Tell them I'm just a passenger." Chloe's eyes softened. "But you're so much more." Naomi shook her head, gently but firmly. "No, that's the point. No one needs to be more than that just to be treated like a human." Chloe stood there for a few seconds, her eyes welling up. Finally, she smiled a sad but warm smile, then retreated to her station. Outside the window, the city lights began to twinkle, weaving a network of golden light sprawling across the land. The plane slowly began to descend. Naomi looked out at the shimmering scene, part of the world still asleep, unaware that above the sky something had permanently changed. Not through noise, not through violent force, but through quiet determination. Respect not something worn with ranks or shielded by a suit. Respect simply sitting there in seat 3A telling the truth and waiting for the world to catch up. And on this flight, the world had caught up. The plane landed smoothly, gently, as if it too understood that it was carrying a sacred mission. The sound of the wheels lightly screeching on the runway. The seatbelt signs lit up. But no one hurried to stand. No one rushed to grab their luggage. Everyone sat still, as if waiting for some invisible thread to tie them together into completion. Naomi opened her eyes. She sat upright, every movement deliberate and precise. She hadn't slept throughout the flight because she didn't need to sleep. She needed clarity, and now she had it. The plane rolled toward a separate gate, far from the bustling crowds in the airport. Through the window, Naomi saw a black SUV parked next to the jet bridge. Two men in gray suits stood beside it, one holding a tablet, the other watching the plane with an intense gaze as if waiting for someone, not a movie star, but a witness to justice. Inside the cabin, passengers slowly unbuckled their seatbelts. No one was laughing. No one was rushing. Some looked at Naomi from the corner of their eyes. Others bowed their heads, avoiding her gaze, not from contempt, but from gratitude, from remorse, because they knew they had witnessed something bigger than themselves. No one ignored Naomi Carter anymore. No one turned away. No one dared to pretend they didn't see Madeline Cross finally stood up. She hesitated for a long time before stepping into the aisle, slowly approaching Naomi. Her voice was hoarse, nearly breaking. "I was wrong," Madeline admitted. "Not just about you, but about how I judge others about who deserves to be here." Naomi didn't respond immediately. She looked directly into Madeline's eyes that had stopped hiding, stopped being arrogant, now exposed in their rawness. You can't erase harm just by acknowledging it exists. Naomi replied, her voice steady. "But you can start by ensuring it doesn't happen again to anyone else." Madeline nodded frantically, almost in desperation. "I will. I promise." Naomi didn't nod. She didn't pat her shoulder in comfort. She simply said, "Then keep that promise." Then she turned away, calm as ever. Behind them, Charles Mercer stood loosely holding his briefcase. "Guess you'll make the front page tomorrow," he said with a faint smile full of respect. "Maybe even get invited to a talk show." Naomi only raised an eyebrow. Not smiling. "They'll miss the message," she replied simply. Charles tilted his head, curious. What message? That no one needs to prove their worth just to sit in a seat they've paid for. Naomi answered matter-of-factly. He let out a small laugh and then extended his hand. "If you ever run for office, I'll give you a vote." Naomi shook his hand briefly, firmly, without any grandiosity. "I'm not planning to run," she said. "What I care about is what happens when people stop running from the truth." The seatbelt sign turned off. The plane's doors opened. Passengers began to disembark one by one. Some gave Naomi a silent nod. Some lowered their heads as they passed out of shame, out of gratitude. Chloe Turner was one of the last to leave the plane. She walked up to Naomi, holding a folded piece of paper in her hand. "I printed this from the internal reward system," Chloe mumbled. "You probably won't need it, but I'm still giving it to you." Naomi took the paper without opening it. "Thank you," she said. "Not for this, but for standing up at the right moment." Chloe's eyes welled with tears. She didn't say another word, turning to leave her step more confident than when she boarded the flight. Naomi was the last to leave the cabin. As she stepped down the plane's stairs, she took a deep breath of the cool night air. Two agents in gray suits stood beside the black SUV, waiting nearby, nodding at her with a wordless respect. "Everything is complete, ma'am," one of them said. "Video report statements the board has begun taking action." Naomi nodded slightly. "Good. Do you need anything else from us?" the other asked. Naomi shook her head. "Just ensure this story doesn't end with this flight." The car door opened. Naomi stepped inside and the door closed behind her with a soft click. The SUV drove off, leaving the flickering airport lights behind. Resting her head against the cool window, Naomi watched the long streams of golden lights pass by. Somewhere in those lights were faces she would never forget. Not because of the words they spoke, but because of the moments they stayed silent, because of how they turned away, because of the time it took them to start caring. But eventually they did care. And sometimes that alone is a victory. No noise, no declarations, just something real. A week later, a major newspaper ran the headline, "Passenger Mocked by Flight Attendant, One Phone Call, the Entire Airline Shaken." The story spread across social media, but Naomi didn't care, because somewhere in a small training room, new rules were being printed. Somewhere on another flight, a flight attendant was thinking more carefully before speaking. Somewhere, a passenger who once stayed silent was preparing to stand up. And maybe someone who once thought they didn't deserve to be there would choose to stay. Because someone like Naomi Carter had done it. not to get attention, but to make the world stop. Pretending it didn't see, she didn't shout. She didn't demand anyone to defend her. Naomi Carter simply sat there with dignity and unwavering resolve. And then, with that very calmness, she made the entire cabin reflect on itself. Those who had turned away began to bow their heads. Those who thought they belonged more realized the true value of respect. Those who had stayed silent now began to speak up. Not everyone is ready to create change, but some, like Naomi, only need to be present at the right moment, and that's enough. They don't fight for the spotlight. They don't need to be praised. They let the truth speak for itself. If this story resonates with you, remember, true strength is not in the loudest voice. It's in those who are strong enough not to shout, but still manage to be heard. Don't forget to share this video with those you believe need to be reminded that we don't need to prove our worth to deserve respect, and subscribe to the channel today to join us on more emotional storytelling journeys like this one. See you in the next stories.